You think I'll let you freeload in my house any longer? Pack your things and get out. Today, the words hit me like a slap, but I should have seen it coming. Reuben, my stepfather, had been looking for an excuse to get rid of me since the day he married my mom. His voice was sharp, dripping with disdain, and his piercing glare dared me to challenge him. I stood there, frozen, my fists clenched at my sides, the weight of his command sinking into my chest like stones. "I'm not freeloading," I said, my voice low but firm. "I'm working on getting my life together." He laughed, a short, bitter sound that filled the kitchen. "Your life? You're 22 years old, Adrian. No job, no future, and no respect for this house. You're a burden. A burden?" That word stuck in my throat, choking me with a mix of anger and shame. My mom, Elena, stood a few feet away, her eyes darting between us like she was caught in the crossfire of a war she couldn't stop. But she said nothing. She never did when Reuben was like this. I could see it in her face, fear, exhaustion, and a sliver of guilt. She wanted to defend me, but she couldn't. She depended on Reuben too much to risk his wrath. "I'm not going anywhere," I shot back, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound defiant. "This is my home, too." "Not anymore," Reuben snapped. His voice boomed through the small kitchen, making the walls seem like they were closing in. "You've got until the end of the day to pack your things, or I'll throw them on the lawn myself." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He meant it. Reuben didn't bluff. I glanced at my mom one last time, hoping for some kind of intervention, but she looked away, her silence louder than any word she could have spoken. I turned and left the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the quiet tension that filled the house. My room, my sanctuary, felt smaller as I walked in. The walls were lined with sketches, unfinished canvases, and stacks of notebooks filled with ideas I hadn't yet had the courage to bring to life. Art was my escape, my outlet, but it was also part of the reason Reuben hated me. "Get a real job," he'd sneered countless times. "Stop wasting your time with this nonsense." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. The weight of his words pressed down on me. For years, I'd felt like an intruder in my own home, a constant reminder of a life Reuben had inherited but never wanted. The truth was, I'd been trying to stay out of his way. I worked odd jobs here and there, enough to cover my personal expenses, but not enough to move out. Reuben didn't see that, though. To him, I was just a failed experiment, someone he could blame for whatever went wrong in his life. But it wasn't just about me. There was something else driving his anger, something unspoken but palpable. Reuben had always been suspicious of me, watching me with a judgmental eye, like he was searching for evidence to confirm his worst assumptions. I thought about leaving, about finding a way to start fresh somewhere else, but the thought terrified me. Where would I go? What would I do? My savings were meager at best, and I had no real plan. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I heard a soft knock on my door. "Adrian?" My mom's voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. I didn't answer. I couldn't. She opened the door anyway, stepping inside like she was testing the waters. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want this to happen." "Then stop it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Tell him I'm not leaving." She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't understand. He's under a lot of stress, and I'm the easiest target," I replied bitterly. "I get it." She didn't argue. She just stood there, wringing her hands, before turning to leave. "Just don't make it worse, Adrian," she said softly before closing the door behind her. Her words lingered, but they didn't help. If anything, they made the knot in my chest tighten. I looked around my room, at the life I'd built in this small, imperfect space. Leaving felt impossible, but staying was unbearable. Reuben didn't want me here, and maybe he never had. But there was one thing he didn't know, something I'd kept hidden, even from myself, until recently. Something that could change everything. As I reached for the drawer where I'd hidden the proof of my secret, I felt a surge of defiance. If Reuben wanted me gone, I'd give him a reason to regret it. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power in my chest. He thought he knew who I was, but he had no idea. And soon, he'd see exactly what he was trying to get rid of. "You're awfully quiet for someone who thinks they're in charge, Reuben." The words left my mouth before I could stop them, my tone sharp, deliberate, and charged with years of pent-up resentment. Reuben, standing in my doorway, looked stunned for a moment. His usual air of authority faltered, replaced by something new uncertainty. "I told you to pack and get out," he barked, his voice cracking just enough for me to notice. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Adrian." I leaned against my dresser, arms crossed. My pulse raced, but I refused to let him see me sweat. "Harder? You think this is hard for you?" I laughed bitterly. "You don't even know the half of it." His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "I don't have time for your drama." "No, but you had time for Sebastian," I said, letting the name fall like a grenade between us. Reuben froze. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from his face, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked vulnerable. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. I stepped closer, refusing to back down. "I'm talking about Sebastian, your best friend, the man you've known for years, the man you trust more than anyone else." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. The man I've been seeing for the past 6 months, his face contorted with disbelief, anger, and something that resembled betrayal. "You're lying," he hissed, but there was no strength behind it. "I'm not," I said calmly, reaching into my drawer and pulling out my phone. I unlocked it, scrolling to the photos and messages Sebastian and I had exchanged. Pictures of us together, texts filled with affection and plans for the future. I held the phone out to him. "See for yourself." Reuben hesitated, his hand hovering in the air before he snatched the phone from me. His eyes scanned the screen, his expression shifting with every swipe. The anger in his features deepened. But there was something else there too, pain. "You," he began, his voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes blazing. "You went behind my back? With Sebastian?" "I didn't go behind your back," I snapped. "I didn't owe you anything. You've treated me like a parasite since day one. But Sebastian? He saw me. He listened. He cared in ways you never could. Don't you dare lecture me," he spat, his face red with fury. "You had no right. I had every right." I cut him off, my voice rising. I was suffocating in this house, in this family. Sebastian was the only person who made me feel like I mattered. The room was heavy with silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. Reuben's hands shook as he clenched my phone, his knuckles white. "You don't know what you've done," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I took a step closer, my voice softer but no less determined. "I know exactly what I've done, and I'm not sorry." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw something crack in him, something raw and broken. "He's married," Reuben said, his voice barely audible. "I know," I replied, "and that's between him and his wife. This is between you and me." Reuben staggered back, dropping onto the edge of my bed as if the weight of it all had finally crushed him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling. I watched him, unsure of what I felt. Triumph? Guilt? Relief? Maybe all three, tangled into something unrecognizable. "Why?" he asked, his voice muffled. "Why not?" I countered, my tone softer now. "You pushed me away at every turn. You made it clear I'd never be good enough for this family. Sebastian made me feel like I was more than just a problem to be fixed." He looked up at me, his eyes red. You think this fixes anything? No, I admitted, but it's the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I don't care what you think about me. Reuben stared at me, his expression unreadable. You've changed everything, Adrian. Maybe, I said, turning to leave the room, but that's not my problem anymore. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a strange mix of emotions, freedom, fear, and a flicker of hope. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The house felt unbearably quiet. I sat at the bottom of the stairs, my bag packed and resting beside me. The confrontation with Reuben had left me drained, my emotions swirling in a chaotic storm I couldn't quite name. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, slow and heavy, like he was dragging the weight of the world with him. Reuben stopped a few feet away, his face pale, his usual composure shattered. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question, just a statement, flat and emotionless. I nodded, keeping my gaze steady. "You made it clear I don't belong here." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. For the first time, he looked older, almost fragile. "Adrian, he paused, his voice catching. "I didn't mean for it to get like this." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "You didn't mean for it? Reuben, you've been pushing me out for years." Today was just the breaking point. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he lowered himself onto the stairs, leaving a careful distance between us. The silence between us stretched thin, heavy with things neither of us wanted to say. "I thought I knew you," he said finally, his voice low. "But today, you blindsided me." "Sebastian," he stopped, shaking his head. I trusted him. "So did I replied, my tone softer now. "And maybe that was a mistake. But for what it's worth, he made me feel seen. That's more than I can say for you." Reuben flinched like I'd struck him, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time. "I've been hard on you," he admitted. "Too hard. I thought if I pushed you, you'd shape up. Prove me wrong." "Prove you wrong about what?" I asked, my voice sharp again. "That I'm not a disappointment? That I'm worth something? That I deserve to be here?" He didn't answer right away. His hands fidgeted, his fingers tracing the edge of the step. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't need to prove anything to me. I needed to stop judging you for not being who I thought you should be." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Part of me wanted to accept them, to believe he meant it. But another part of me, the part that had spent years enduring his cold stares and cutting words, couldn't let go that easily. "Reuben," I said, my voice steady, "it's too late for apologies. You don't get to rewrite everything with a few words." "I know," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "But I had to say it, for whatever it's worth." I nodded, the knot in my chest loosening just a little. "Thanks, but I still have to leave." "I know," he said again, quieter this time. "But before you go, I want you to have something." He stood and walked to the living room, returning with a small box. He handed it to me, his expression unreadable. "It's not much," he said, "but it's yours." I opened the box carefully, my breath hitching when I saw what was inside. It was a sketchbook, bound in worn leather, with my initials embossed on the corner. It was the same sketchbook I'd begged my mom for years ago, the one she said was too expensive. "I found it in a shop a while back," Reuben said, his voice hesitant. I thought maybe you'd like it, but I didn't know how to give it to you without it feeling awkward." I traced my fingers over the smooth leather, a lump forming in my throat. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Adrian." "I really do." I stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder and clutching the sketchbook tightly. "I don't know if I'll ever find it," I admitted, "but at least now I can try." We didn't hug, didn't exchange promises to stay in touch. We weren't there yet, and maybe we never would be. But as I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of closure, like the chapter we'd written together had finally come to an end. The world outside was bright, the air crisp with the scent of rain. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt free.